Keki and Daruwalla's poem, The Revolt of the Salt Slaves, relates to a revolt by slaves working in a salt mine and on rocks of salt. Both the slaves and their masters were black. The only white thing there was the sunlight, besides, of course, the rocks of salt and the salt columns. The slaves working on the salt rocks were being guarded by slave drivers who showed no mercy to them and lashed the ones who seemed to be lazy. Every lash evoked a groan from the slave who had received it. The duty of the slaves was to cut pieces of rock from the salt mine. One night the slaves revolted against their cruel masters. For one night they were quite cheerful because they had power in their hands. For that one night they could even sleep with women and feel the coolness of the women's bodies while the stars shone above. This was the land of salt and iron, and these slaves wrote down the iron truth in letters of blood. In other words, in the course of the revolt, the slaves had attacked their supervisors physically and caused many of them to bleed. A number of slave drivers were killed too. These slaves could not have been expected to show any loyalty to their supervisors on such an occasion. The occasion was a revolt by the slaves against the slave drivers, and any loyalty on this occasion would have been out of place. Although slaves used to be a purchasable commodity and belonged wholly to the rich men who had paid a price for them, there are always limits to human patience and endurance, even to the patience and endurance of slaves. Occasions did rise when, driven too hard, slaves revolted against their owners, or at least against their owners' representatives who supervised their work. And on those occasions, of course, there used to be a lot of bloodshed. The imagery in the poem is noteworthy. The whiteness of salt is emphasized several times in the course of the poem because the color of the salt stood in sharp contrast to the black color of the human beings. The sense of triumph of the slaves was, of course, short-lived. Neither prisoners in a jail nor slaves working in a mine can ever hope to gain a permanent victory. But the short-lived triumph must have brought ample satisfaction to the slaves because as a result of the violence adopted by them, the slave drivers lay impaled on earth in the blinding sands. The conclusion which is drawn by the poet from this incident is that truth to one's salt is hardly the thing to expect from slaves in a salt mine. This conclusion is perfectly valid and it reads like an epigram or an aphorism. The use of the word salt in the penultimate line of the poem has a special significance because to be true to one's salt is an idiom which means loyalty to one's boss or fidelity to some principle. In the kind of situation described in the poem, a laborer should not be expected to show any loyalty to his boss because a slave owner or a slave driver does not deserve any loyalty. A slave owner does not treat slaves as human beings.